Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. Some of you might know it's Diwali, and strangely enough, we decided to have this special event. But we've tried to bring in the festive spirit with the colorful clothing you're wearing, and that will get us all in the mood as we go along. So this evening, the roundtable is on a somewhat somber topic, which is on the politics of extremism and violence in Pakistan and India. We have with us three speakers who are distinguished because of their academic contribution, but also because they are at heart activists, and more people like them in these times. Please specially to invite Dr. Taimur Rahman, who joins us from Lahore. He's an associate professor at the University of Management Sciences at Lahore, a very renowned university actually, LAMS. And but besides an academic who has written a book on the class structure of Pakistan, he has his own music band. How cool is that? Okay, so which is called Lal, and it's they mainly compose music on it's sort of resistance music, and he campaigns against religious extremism, and they're great. I mean, I've heard them live as well as on YouTube. So if we can have a mehfil at some point, I don't think it's possible, but we'll see if we can just persuade Taimur towards the end of the day, if it's possible. I also am joined by my colleagues here, Dr. Dipesh Anand, who many of you would know. He's the head of politics and international relations, and he has written books, especially one on Hindu nationalism in India, which would be relevant for today, but also has written on Tibet previously. And I'm also joined by Natasha Paul, who again is quite an eclectic individual. She's a novelist, an academic, a poet, an artist, and her novel Residue was shortlisted for the Man Asian Literary Prize, and she's written on themes of identity, nation-state, and borders as well. A prolific writer in her own right. So I'm joined by these speakers, and what we will do is really give them a couple of minutes to share their thoughts on what are the sources of extremism and violence in post-colonial democracies, in particular Pakistan and India. And of course, I mean, these are questions that we have to deal with, not just for this moment, but keep them going because of the times we are. Only recently in Pakistan, some of you would know, people from the Ahmadiyya community have been targeted very viciously, including a lawyer who was killed recently, and 3 others were charged for blasphemy. India, on the other hand, claims to be the only democracy in South Asia, but really in terms of its treatment of minorities, it's only gone quite vicious recently, especially if you look at the refugee crisis coming in from Myanmar. India's stance has been, in principle, to help out minorities from Bangladesh and Pakistan, but really that's for people from Sikh, Parsi, Christian, and Hindu communities, whereas they have not allowed Muslims from, in this case, from Burma to make their way to India. So, these are times of extreme tolerance and violence, and really the questions that our speakers will be discussing today are ones that we have to keep engaging with, and in many ways bring out there. So Taimur, would you like to start?
Sure, be happy to. Thank you very much. This is a very diverse audience, and so sometimes with such a ethnically diverse audience, people coming from all different sort of backgrounds, it's difficult for me to know where I should pitch my talk or what I should talk about. And also because I assume that this is an ideologically diverse audience, and hence people come with different preconceived notions, and I'm not quite sure which ones I should address first. So what I'll do instead is that I would like to talk mainly about what extremism represents in Pakistan, in the sense of whether it is some sort of innate Muslim or religious or Islamic response, or whether it is some sort of a well thought out political strategy for social control. Now, in the mainstream media, if we look at how religious extremism is often portrayed or analyzed, it seems to me to be the case that either religion is linked directly to extremism, or Muslim culture generically or Pakistani culture may be linked to extremism in one way or another. And while there are many efforts against this, and many people who point out how Pakistani culture or Muslim culture or Islamic culture, however we define these terms, that there are many offshoots of it, there's much diversity in it, and how much of that culture doesn't conform to the stereotype of extremism. Nonetheless, a very important part of the picture is left out. How did Pakistan come to have arguably a very strong movement for religious extremism? To answer this question, I have to take you back into post-colonial Pakistan. We're still in post-colonial Pakistan, but the Pakistan immediately after the creation, immediately after colonialism. Pakistan was not a very advanced country in terms of its industrial development, but soon into the 1950s, it became part of the American sphere of interest. And with the Green Revolution, it achieved quite rapid industrialization in the 1960s. In fact, industrial rates of growth touched about 19%, very high. And overall GDP was growing at above 6%, which is what the World Bank at that time, the International Bank for the Reconstruction and Development, or whatever it was called at that time, recommended as the GDP figure that ought to be touched in order for third world countries to eliminate underdevelopment as well as eliminate poverty and so on. The 1960s created this incredibly rapid growth, though, created two major contradictions in Pakistan. The first was a contradiction between the different regions or national groups within Pakistan or nations within Pakistan. Pakistan is a multinational state, even though officially we never recognize that fact, but that's really what it is. So much of the industrial development in Pakistan was concentrated and focused either in two main urban cities, Lahore and Karachi, or relatively speaking, in areas that surrounded these cities. And the result of that was that many people outside of these areas, in Balochistan, in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, inside of Sindh, as well as in the many districts of Punjab, and most importantly, in what was then East Pakistan and today's Bangladesh, felt incredibly alienated from the model of development that was undertaken in the 1960s. They felt that their resources had been used, their labor power had been used, but they had not received the benefits of that industrialization. And the second contradiction, the second social gulf that opened up in society, was the gulf between the rich and the poor. And I was maybe becoming fashionable once again to talk about class conflict, thanks to Jeremy Corbyn, or thanks to all the young people who've been supporting Corbyn. But really, it really is the case that by the end of the 1960s, Pakistan experienced a class movement on a scale that it had not seen before and has not seen since. 1968 became the watershed moment where working class people spilled out in hundreds of thousands onto the streets of my country, filling out protests, filling out main streets with red flags, demanding change, demanding a larger franchise in the development of the country. This led to a major crisis. On the one hand, it led to the breakup of the country because the establishment, and by the establishment I mean the military dictatorship at the time, refused to compromise with either of these movements. And in fact, for them, the threat of nationalism was so large that they opted to undertake an extremely brutal military operation that resulted in a genocide in East Pakistan. That finally led to the creation of Bangladesh today. In West Pakistan, after the defeat at the hands of India in 1971, the army retreated, the establishment retreated, and a left of center government was elected, came to power. They immediately proceeded with some nationalizations, some land reforms, and other pro-labor reforms. To meet this challenge, these reforms that this left of center government undertook, called the party that led it was called the Pakistan People's Party, really upset the old Ayub elite. Much of their wealth was taken away in nationalizations, and also the landed classes were not too happy. A third major section of society that wasn't happy was the clergy, or the mullahs as we call them. And they were not happy because they felt that the left-wing socialist message of the time was against the spirit of Islam. Now this is the time when the old Ayub elite of Pakistan opts very consciously to use political Islam as a weapon against the nationalist movement within Pakistan and against the class movement within Pakistan. If you look at Pakistan before this time period, you do not see the presence of religious extremism in the way that you do today. Al-Shams and Al-Badr brigades were some of the brigades that were created deliberately to target nationalists in East Pakistan. Similarly, student unions were created, extreme right-wing student unions like the Jamiat were created in Punjab University and other universities to target the left, to target leftist professors, to target leftist students and leftist organizations in universities. And so began an entire campaign in society that then resulted in an 11-year-long martial law, which chose to undertake a campaign called Islamization. This is the period of General Ziaul Haq, which lasted from 1977, July 1977, all the way till 1988, when he was assassinated. We still don't know by whom. And in this entire period, now this coup occurred before the Afghan revolution or the Saud revolution. General Ziaul Haq then appealed to the United States of America for help and assistance and said, I will help you fight the communists that are sitting in Afghanistan. Brzezinski came up with the strategy that he would then create, that the United States would then fund and create Islamic extremists in Pakistan to export to Afghanistan to basically destroy the Saud revolution. And so an entire apparatus was supported and created with American funds, with Pakistani, with the training of the Inter-Services Intelligence, that's the main intelligence agency of the Pakistani army, and also the financial assistance of Saudi Arabia and Britain, as well as France. Now this created a massive, massive network of madrasas, about 22,000 madrasas. There were only about 5,000 before this jihad began. It created in the Urdu press the dominance of people who thought, who were religious fundamentalists. It created in the universities, and especially among student unions, till they were banned, the dominance of extreme right-wing student unions, and these right-wing student unions used incredible amounts of fascist violence to beat out the left, and also liberals. And thirdly, it required the destruction of the trade union movement, which again was smashed with state power. Once all of these things, we had 11 years of that. Just yesterday, I was listening to a speech by a very famous journalist called Nasir Zaidi, who was one of the four journalists who was sentenced to be flogged. He was one of the 3 journalists on whom that sentence was carried out. They lashed him 15 times. He's a very frail man, but he withstood that. That's the kind of repression that I'm talking about. Now, when General Zia was assassinated, and we still don't know how it was done or who did it, we had the quote-unquote, the restoration of democracy. But this restoration occurred under the condition that the military would continue to call the main shots. It would continue to be consulted on economic policy. It would definitely dominate over foreign policy. It would certainly dominate over any question relating to Afghanistan and Kashmir, and that the elected government essentially would not interfere in any way in the internal organization or reorganization of the military. And so, while the Cold War came to an end in 1991, in fact, by 1988, Gorbachev had withdrawn troops. Pakistan continued to fight that jihad with the Afghan government till 1992, and then the Afghan government sort of reconciled and tried to bring the other players into a coalition, etc. Nonetheless, that infrastructure, that jihadist infrastructure, remained intact, and it was being used to export counter-revolution in Afghanistan, in Chechnya, in Bosnia, in Kashmir, and to destroy the democratic and progressive movement inside Pakistan. This is the honest and frank reality. So if you want to put it into an academic framework, I highly recommend the work of Antonio Gramsci, who talks about the rise of fascism in Italy after the strike of the Turin workers in the south of Italy. He says the fascist movement arose as a response to the workers' movement. It's much the same in Pakistan, with the exception that it was the workers' movement and the nationalist movement in Pakistan which resulted in the rise of religious extremism, which in my opinion is Pakistan's brand of fascism, nothing else. So when we talk about religious extremism today, in the world today, of course that fascism could not be contained in Pakistan. It spread its wings in many parts of the world, and eventually it attacked also the United States of America, who were its original financiers, ironically, because that's in the character, sadly, of fascism. So once it escalated out of control, then a narrative had to be constructed in which those who had been party to, in developing that fascism could say, oh, we have nothing to do with this, God knows these crazy Muslims and what they're up to, and so on and so forth. So that's why we see in the mainstream media this rather strange ahistoric coverage of religious extremism, terroristic violence, which leaves us with the impression that maybe there's something innately wrong with Muslims or innately wrong with Muslim societies or countries. It's not the case. Rather, it is the case that these are societies that have not only experienced class struggle, massive progressive movements, democratic movements, but have also experienced fascistic reactions to those movements. And we live now in a period, in what I call a post-fascist period, where the period of fascism is over, but fascism itself is not over. It continues to exist side by side with the democratic progressive movement and other movements and other trends within Pakistan. Since my time is almost up, I will say at the end that though they may be strong today, but I believe that the progressive people of the world, whether in Pakistan or in India or in the United Kingdom or anywhere else in the world, will find a way to defeat fascism, whether it exists in one form or another form, in a religious form or in a secular form or in any other form, and that we will be successful in creating a progressive world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Taimur, for explaining to us what the sources of extremism in Pakistan are and taking us back through history. And explaining all the sort of effects on left-wing politics and so on. So thank you for that. And Divesh, would you like to reflect on India?
Thank you. Thanks, Taimur, for making a start here. In fact, while Taimur was speaking, I was thinking, should I speak about India or South Asia in general? And so I'm going to cover both of them. Because, of course, right now a lot of us are thinking about what's happening to Rohingya Muslims in Burma and Myanmar. So I would start with that point. Right? So to one extent, and when we talk of politics of extremism and violence in these countries or South Asia, other parts, again, if we call them religious extremism or extremism, we think that there's a mainstream that's more tolerant, not violent. So that extremism is still, therefore, a thing of minority. So for instance, if we talk of religious extremism in Indian context, we'll be talking of Hindu fascism, and we'll somehow assume that Hindu fascists are minority within the wider Hindu society, wider Hindu body. And again, same with the case of Burma, where we think of Buddhist fascism, we'll think of fascism which is somehow confined to only few, not the many. Now, so first and foremost, I mean, if I try to emulate what Temur was doing, and if you look at I would say the preferred secularist narrative of extremism in India, it would go something like this, that Indian nationalism was secular, more or less, wanting equal citizenship for all, and that was the Congress version of nationalism. And then there were these Muslim communalists, Muslim League, and then of course there were also Hindu communalists, such as the RSS. So Congress was somehow in between Muslim communalists and Hindu communists, and they had that left and the right and the centrist element all together. So India, that was formed in after 1947, was broadly speaking a secular republic, a socialist republic. So it didn't have the problems that Pakistan had, and therefore Hindu extremism is more of a product of 80s onwards, where things started going wrong in India, where right-wing movement, they demanded they demanded destruction of a mosque to build a temple, saying that that's where the God was born many millions of years ago. And so it started with that, and that movement became bigger, and of course the left was divided whether to call them fascist or not. In 1990s, the Indian left would generally call them fascist, but at the same time had also been in partnership and in coalition at one point in time, because Congress was seen as the main enemy. It has changed now. And even today, the Indian left is divided over whether to call it fascism or not. So the mainstream left would avoid the word fascism. Somehow fascism is seen as something that was only peculiar to Europeans. That's the kind of narrative they use. But they would say that basically 1980s was a period when it started rising, 1990s things changed, and of course it's somehow connected to liberalization, globalization, all those phenomena. That's there. But the way I would see it, I mean, in terms of what are the roots of violence and roots of this kind of violence, so I would call it majoritarian nationalism. So what we are talking of religious nationalism is actually majoritarian nationalism, where one group which is in majority claims the right to dominate that state. Now they would, for instance, in the case of Burma or Myanmar, they would say that Buddhists are the majority, and hence Burma should be a Buddhist state where Burmese Buddhists should be recognized and respected as the superior ones. In case of India, the focus would be that Hindus are the majority, and hence Hindus, it is if not Hindu nation, at least even within secular nation, there has to be recognition that Hindus are someone who should be respected. Who are the enemies? The minorities are the enemies in that kind of context. So it's majoritarian nationalism. We find similar kind of case. We had found the extreme version of it in case of Sri Lanka in 1980s and 90s, and the extremes of violence there in all other countries. So what's happening there in Pakistan or India are not exceptional, but part and parcel of majoritarian nationalism that emerged and that competed with more inclusive notions of nationalism. Right? So that's there. But the way I would see the connection is therefore through nationalism, and I'll say something about my own work where I've looked at how does Hindu nationalism, so I'm not going to explain why Hindu nationalism arose, but I'm going to explain how Hindu nationalism portrays minorities who are disenfranchised de facto as the enemy. So the way they function is by saying that Hindus are majority but they're divided. Right? So it's a divided house, and secularists are those who are opportunist Hindus who are appeasing minorities. Right? So the notion is very clear that Muslims are minorities, Christians are minorities, and communists are, of course, enemies. So three enemies, they would include Muslims, Christians, and communists, and all three are seen as foreign. So Muslims because, of course, their holy land is outside India, Christians because their holy land is outside India, and communists because they come from outside. Right? That's what they would argue. And then, in the past, they used to say also westernized media. They stopped saying that because more or less the media is with Hindu nationalism now. But they would say secularist. So somehow Muslims can never be secularists, Christians can never be secularists. Secularists are those opportunist Hindus who want to vote from Muslims and Christians, who are seen as more organized, right? And therefore they would appease the minorities. And what is Hindu nationalism? So Hindu nationalism is a phenomenon that portrays them as enemies and says Hindu people should unite together, should work together, and show the minority the right place. And that right place in them, and I use that slogan a lot. I don't use it, I mean, the Hindu nationalists use it, and I repeat it. They say, Musalman ke do histan, Pakistan ye kabristan. So the idea that Muslims have two places, either they should be expelled, so Pakistan, and therefore in recent times, in the last 3 years, the common language, some of you would not know, India would not realize it, they say, if you criticize the Hindu national government, they say, oh, send them to Pakistan, go to Pakistan. So there's an obsession with Pakistan. So I don't think without Pakistan, Hindu nationalists could survive. They need Pakistan in that context, right? So they say Pakistan or Kabristan, so cemetery. So the idea is either they should be expelled or they should be killed. So there's a element of genocide or of expulsion. And third element, of course, is, which is a polite version, that they should just keep quiet and accept Hindus as the majority. So in recent times, for instance, we have seen in Indian context, they say, oh, why do Muslims not sing certain songs? Or why are Muslims not nationalists? And how would Muslims show that they're nationalists? So those kind of rhetoric dominate Indian news channel, they dominate the Indian political scene, and there's constant focus on Muslims having to prove them loyal to India. Right? That's the rhetoric. Broadly, of course, as I said, within Hindu nationalism there lies a strong anxiety. The anxiety is not necessarily about Muslims and Christians, it's not. They are the scapegoats, they are the easy targets. Because the reality is in India, Muslims are even more disenfranchised than Dalit people. And Dalit are the ones who have been historically marginalized, and majority of Muslims are actually from Dalit or Bahujan background. So their caste would also be the dominated caste. Right? So what we find therefore is that there's a lot of focus on disenfranchising Muslims, but the real target, or the main target, not real, main target of the Hindu nationalists are the wider Hindu society itself. They want to transform it, where they want more and more Hindus to recognize themselves as not those oppressed by the Hindu religion historically, like Dalit Bahujan, but those who are Hindus together. So Muslims and Christians play that role of scapegoat, where you bring then the Hindu society together by saying, look, your problem, and let's take example of Gujarat. In 1980s, Gujarat is one of the places where Hindu nationalists are very strong. And Gujarat is also a place where, and Maharashtra also, are places where the trade union movement was quite strong. So when deindustrialization took place, you had the situation of Muslim workers and Hindu workers being made to fight each other, and therefore for Hindu workers not to see the Hindu capitalists as a problem, but Muslim workers as a problem. So those kind of things would take place. There's some connection there. So what we find therefore in Indian context is deindustrialization, those things affecting the rise of Hindu nationalism, but essentially discourse of insecurity which treats minorities as scapegoats in order to then transform the entire idea of Indian nation. But when we go back to the root of violence, Hindu nationalism is violent. Without violence it cannot function, but it is part and parcel of Indian nationalism. So when we go back to even Congress version of nationalism, we find something in common between Congress nationalism and the Hindu nationalism, and that is the modern idea of nationalism. And I would argue this is what also common in the case of Myanmar or Pakistan or Sri Lanka and other places, which is when post-colonial states were formed, they essentially emulated colonial states. So the white faces are gone, and brown, not too brown, because even there the idea was not too dark, you shouldn't have too dark faces there. You had brown faces or the whitish brown faces, and I say not only racial terms, ethnic terms, but more in terms of class terms and ethnic terms, and class terms and privilege terms. So the idea was post-colonial nation state making in South Asia was essentially a copy of colonial state. Change of rulers, but without the change of rules. So when we therefore take example of the rules or laws that exist and the kind of discourses that exist, the institutions that exist in both these countries, you find a certain commonality. They are essentially colonial institutions that get transformed. And again, when we take example of Burma also, we know that it's very much the divide and rule policy is connected to the divide and rule policy that the British are following, and the state is following that. And I use examples of, the best example is of military. So, for instance, in Pakistan, of course, the army is a sort of a sacrosanct institution. You shouldn't be challenging army, because if you challenge army, then you're going against the nation, right? Now, in case of India too, now India did not witness strong military rule, but even in case of India, you have similar situation that Indian army is seen as the custodian of the nation. But the reality is the origin of both Indian army and Pakistani army and Bangladeshi army are the same. They are the colonial British Indian army. And what was that colonial army? That colonial army was essentially a slave army. So you have a situation in Pakistan, India and Bangladesh where the army that was created and nurtured to dominate people then claimed to represent the people. Right? Now in case of Pakistan they succeeded more easily. In case of India it's now the Hindu nationalists who say, oh, don't criticize the army because that's not acceptable. Right? So I would therefore argue that the issue of extremism and violence in both India, Pakistan and the region are not only connected to the class politics, they are, but it's, which is connected, but it's also connected to the entire formation of post-colonial state-making, nation-state-making in the region. And until and unless we recognize that post-colonial state-making, which is of course colonial and post-colonial both, we would be ignoring the root of the violence. And the root of the violence is the statehood, not religion in this case. Yes, religious tinge can be there, religion can play a crucial role in mobilizing people, but essentially the statehood. So therefore, when we also, and I'll conclude with that, and Temur pointed out the nationality part, nations, different nations, multi-nation state. Even India is a multinational state, but they're not recognizing itself as multinational state. If anything, both the secular nationalists and the Hindu nationalists would argue that, no, India is somehow one nation. Unity in diversity with a focus on unity, not the diversity part. So diversity is depoliticized diversity. But in reality, India or Pakistan could have gone for a more multi-ethnic, multinational notion, where they could have recognized Kashmiris, Nagas, Manipuris, people from Telangana, people from Balochistan, Pashtuns, all as different nations working together within a particular context. But as I said, because Indian nationalism portrays itself against the two-nation theory, which is problematic, but one-nation theory is also equally problematic, and both of them would agree that it's not multinational theory. So in that case, there's not much difference between Jinnah and Nehru and Gandhi, where they accept a one-nation or two-nation theory, not multinational theory. And the impact of that, of course, therefore, is not only the majority of people which would be Dalit, Bahujan, workers and others excluded, but impact would also be disproportionate upon those who don't identify with these states. And that would include, for instance, Kashmir in Indian context, Baloch in Pakistan context, Nagas in Indian context, not all Nagas, not all Kashmir, many of them. So a particular form of violence therefore is used by these colonial states, both the religious extremist part, the religious moderate part, the non-religious part and the secular part. All of them would agree that when it comes to nationality question, more or less they'd agree. And they put into defensive the left. Because left by its logic should be about human rights, equality, right to self-determination. But in reality, often the left is also focused or pressurized to be nationalist. Because to be non-nationalist is okay, to be anti-nationalist or declared anti-nationalist is very dangerous, right? So even in case of, let's say, India and too, and I'm sure in extent of Pakistan also, you'll find that the left would also be under pressure to accept the wider dominant state narrative around nationality and accept, therefore, the crux of the state as legitimate, even though that is even though it is that very nation state which is the root of all violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Dipesh, for giving us that account of, basically pinning the roots of extremism in the making of majoritarian nationalism, really, in India, and the kind of exclusions that have come through as a result. Over to you, Dipesh.
So, I'm going to first talk, so two things that I want to point out. One, I just want to focus a little bit on what sorts of things do we mean when we talk about extremism and violence. And then I want to address this question of what are the key sources of this violence, which is one of our briefs for this discussion today. So and I'm focusing on India, but of course this is, India includes, parts of territory and people who would not want to be called India, and also to an extent this is a transnational, multinational, global process of what's happening. So in terms of violence, there are different kinds of violence. Physical violence is, so when we talk about violence, it's not an abstract thing, it is physical violence, it's a whole range of erasures in terms of representation of people who don't fit the norm, and symbolic, it's violence around symbols too. So a very quick brief bit where I just want to talk about, so what the current, since post-2014, of course, Hindutva in India has Hindu nationalism, Hindu majoritarianism, proto-fascism in India has taken on a remarkably dangerous turn, because it seems to be under the radar of a whole lot of people, not just in the country, but also more globally. So what do these people want to do, and what have they in fact been doing? The ideological parent of the current ruling party in India, BJP, their ideological parent is an organization called the RSS, which was founded in 1925. So it goes back to pre-independence India, and also around the time, so this idea that in 1947 there was no right-wing politics and it just happened is not correct, because archival sources and other records of debates at the time indicate that these were really big contentious issues even in 1947, and the right wing was prominent then too. The kind of power, of course, that they have now is extremely dangerous. So what do they want to do with it? They want to, for example, drop things from the preamble such as secular and socialist. People who dissent are told to go to Pakistan. There are riots, there are communal riots that are engineered specifically before elections in order to gain electoral advantage. There are deaths of minorities through lynchings, targeting of journalists. Recently there was the murder of, you might have heard of Gauri Lankesh, a prominent regional media journalist in India who was shot for her views because she was a critic of Hindutva. They have campaigns like Ghar Vapsi, which is return back to home, so reconversion campaigns to get people to acknowledge themselves as Hindus over and above any other identity. There is, of course, a lot of hate speech which is out in the open, and I've previously talked about this, but it bears mention every time that the next leader of after Modi, the guy who's touted as the next big leader, Yogi Adityanath, and who is currently the Chief Minister of India's most populous state, was once, has been, sort of not a willing accomplice of this kind of hate speech, has his own militias, and was once filmed sharing a platform with extremists who called for the exhumation, who called for the exhumation of the graves of Muslim women and to rape their corpses. So these kinds of people are not fringe elements; they are in the central mainstream, and I think that is something we should not forget. There are killings over the beef ban, over the fact that somebody might be transporting cattle can lead to them being lynched. There are the murders of atheists and rationalists. Thank you. A whole range of statements which gain credence, such as killing a cow is equivalent to raping a Hindu girl. Accusations of love jihad, so any marriages that happen across religious divides, across Hindu-Muslim marriages, for example, are part of a concerted strategy on the part of Muslim men to convert Hindu women, and that this is a kind of jihad which is being carried out through romance and marriages. There is of course all kinds of killings of people based on minority symbols, changing of textbooks, the coercion of media houses, and in some cases people who are critical have to resign from their position due to interference from the government, changing the heads of museums, other national institutions, labeling dissenters as pseudo-secular, secular being the kind of borderarization of secular, and of critical media as prostitutes, again with echoes of prostitute, which is also a gender term in its impact. Statements by ruling party MPs, one BJP state minister saying rape is sometimes right, sometimes wrong, and this idea that the idea that this kind of thing is not something that is happening in a fringe is what I want to convey. That this is very much a part and parcel of what happens every other day. So the people who were involved in the people who were accused in the lynching of a Muslim man on the suspicion of the fact that they had beef in his house, which was not proven. All 15 of them have now been given jobs with the state. So there's this violence, then there's little or no condemnation of it. People who condemn it are targeted, and then those who carry out that violence or the proponents of hate speech seem to be rewarded for their actions. So all over it's just it's a terrible thing, and the next generation, the young people, are going to be worst impacted, because there's also a whole range of ideological ways in which their textbooks are being changed. What they are taught is being changed. It makes me think of, so pre the proper Cold War in 1948, the US government made a film which is on YouTube, and I was just looking at it yesterday. It's called Don't Be a Sucker. It's only a 10-15 minute film. Go and watch it. It looks at how this whole process of how fascism sort of starts to begin in a society, how people are impressed upon to hate each other. Anyway, so what is called saffron terrorism or Hindutva and all of this is very real, it's very urgent, and it's not something that is just abstract. When I talked about Akhlaq's murderers being given jobs, lots of other such instances, such as people who are camps with weapons training, the idea that Taj Mahal is dropped off the list of prominent tourist destinations in UP because it's a Muslim thing. Taj Mahal was a Hindu temple in their view. So it's a very concerted attempt to change all sorts of things in society, in people's thinking, and right down to symbolism. Christmas is Good Governance Day, Gandhi's birthday is Clean India Day. So there's a whole range of ways in which movies should promote Indian culture, anything that is westernized is bad, and so on. So this is very real. And even though it is happening in some other part of the world, it is cause for concern because these kinds of things feed off each other. And it's not coincidental that there is a global rise of these misogynist, authoritarian leaders who seem to have a very similar politics. Around both nationalism and neoliberalism. Now the neoliberalism part I will elaborate a bit more. So what are the key sources of this? I think this appeal of majoritarianism, bordering on fascism, which gives the majority, which tries to convert a political majority into a cultural majority and give people a sense of feeling beleaguered and a sense that they have to go and attack an enemy, is extremist. It's violent. It makes people be unable to communicate across lines of differences. And it ends up legitimizing violence. This can, of course, happen anywhere, although today we are talking about South Asia. So what are the key sources of it? The process of othering and the interests it serves, it's really goes back to, if you look at the writings of somebody like Carl Schmitt, it's really the idea of politics as having an enemy which is existential. So your enemy is an existential enemy, and your actions in politics should be about annihilating that enemy and the idea of the nation around that. So that's there. Also theoretically, I think that Hannah Arendt's work on totalitarianism and the difference between power and violence is I think very relevant for our times, because a lot of this gets its traction from the way in which we think of what is power and what is violence. And we think mostly that power is the ability to commit violence. Whereas what she was arguing, and when she was talking about this is in the 60s, what she was saying is that that violence and power are different things, and actually power is something that comes from a consensus and has its base in some kind of consensual understanding. And violence and power are opposites in that when there is no power, there is the resort to violence. Because power is not a negative. Power can be thought of and should be thought of not as negatively but as positively. So that in fact the ability to commit violence or get away with it does not indicate power so much as the lack of power and the need to reinforce violence in the absence of power. Briefly, so that was just a theoretical thing. Thirdly, the idea that nationalism and neoliberalism both have a key role in this. So when it was not coincidental that when launching the demonetization fiasco last year in November, Indian Prime Minister Modi said something about we are going to commit a surgical strike on the black economy. So the idea was that the sense of the nation and the sense of the economy are both, because the surgical strike metaphor, goes back to Kashmir and Pakistan. So the surgical strike against Pakistan, surgical strike against black money. So there is a metaphorical linking of the realms of nation and the realm of economy, and similar sorts of processes that seek to define these two terrains in ways that link nationalism and neoliberalism both, and that end up resulting in an assault on people's rights, both economic and social. So economic violence is a key part of it, of course. The inequality in societies, which has in the Indian case been exacerbated since the liberalization in the early 90s, 91. This inequality is not just about, so the familiar argument that we know from a lot of good governance type literature is that if people are poor, they will be more likely to resort to extremism, right? So that's not the point that I'm making. I'm saying that actually there is a resort to violence and extremism in order to expropriate people from their resources, in order to immiserize them and impoverish them. So these kinds of policies actually enact the violence in the way in which land is taken from people, rights are taken from people, and it's not just that that people who don't have things end up turning towards extremism, but a kind of extremist politics is necessary in order to dispossess people, and that is what we see. So the economic aspect of this is also something that is crucial in the way in which people's rights, both economic and social, are denied. And I think theoretically, because I think it's important to link what we talk about in our theories with what we see in the world, that this way in which we think of economy and culture as separate domains is a key source of how we have this problem. Because we think that the economy is something that's just progressing along an autonomous parallel line and has nothing to do with what's happening in culture. But actually the domains of economy and culture mutually co-constitute each other, because people are not acting at specific times only as people who are participating in an economy or only people who are part of a nation. Both of these processes happen together. It's not coincidental that in India and the rise of Hindutva and the ascendancy of neoliberal ideology happen at the same time. So early 90s onwards, there is the whole Babri Masjid, rise of Hindutva in an explicit way, but also a rise in the kinds of neoliberal ideologies which make the inequality worse and dispossess people further. So these two things happen in parallel. Fourthly or fifthly, the idea of, I think part of the reason for this kind of source of extremism is also that in today's world, the successful strategies of political mobilization and political communication rely a lot on technology, and that can create effects which send out political messages in very sophisticated ways, so that the idea of mixed messages, of saying different things to different sets of people, can be kept up without being falsified or exposed. So in the Indian case, for example, so simultaneously the government will work for the corporate sector, the government will also work for the grassroots sector, they will bring economic development, but they will also maintain a social purity. So it's an ability to have to send out consistent dualities and mixed messages that maintain a state of ambiguity, so that the government cannot be held to account for any one particular position, because there is at any time lots of juggling balls in the air. And I think that lots of these kinds of leaders do that exceptionally well. Also, many of the, I think, political communication companies that work for these leaders are similar. Certainly once when I was presenting, this is pre-coup Turkey, when I was presenting there, it turned out that the company that worked for political communication aspect of Erdogan was also the same that worked for the BJP, and that both the leaders had used holograms. So there's also a way in which technology and the similar kind of package of how do you technologically package a political message that's problematic but send it out in a way that people are confused by it and are constantly grappling to know what it is that the government actually intends to do. So there isn't a clear platform, because there are lots of different things that are in the air at any point in time. The next point, sixthly, about the post-colonial nationalism, and this is specific to South Asia. The post-colonial nationalism came from an anti-colonial imperative, which was about, okay, we are all part of this one India, whether we felt it or not. So parts of the country, such as Kashmir, the northeast, which were not integrated in the same way into the nationalist struggle, end up having a whole different experience afterwards. And the way in which post-colonial nationalism constantly needed to define itself against an idea of the West. So while emulating the aspiration and consumption desires of the West, at the same time say that we are socially purer and we don't have any of the moral faults of the West. So the role that the idea of the West plays in post-colonial nationalism is complicated, problematic, and can lead to various kinds of extremisms that don't come across as extremism, because on the one hand you have these malls and people are going to get development, which is essentially just more goods, but on the other hand you will also be able to maintain a kind of purity and you will not be affected by Western culture. So it's both of these things happen at the same time. The politics of corruption is deeply entrenched in the political domain, resentments building up over time. And politics as a source, specifically political domain, as in party political domain, as a source of upward economic mobility. Entry into politics is very hard in India. So typically any senior political leader would have to either have already a pre-existing political family connection or a specific elite status as a way of being taken seriously in politics. And to be a politician for a certain number of years means that you can, a number of scams, a lot of money, a lot of accumulating of money. and little accountability for that. So I guess through some of these points, what I'm trying to say is that extremism takes many forms. There's violence, violent extremism, there's symbolic sort of violence, but there's also this other kind of extremism, which is the extremism of a political and economic ideology that is underlying all of this. And some of the stuff around the entry into politics being so difficult and so fraught with intimidation and violence is part of why politics political domain doesn't change much. And lastly, the point that I think that Divesh also made about this idea of how the links between militarism, masculinity, nationalism. A certain kind of nationalism is being, a certain kind of India, a certain kind of leader, this idea of the strongman fascist leader, with emphasis on the man. And how well it goes with the idea of a state that has changed very little through most of the 20th century. Cynthia Enloe talks about how, even with decolonization and a whole range of new nation states that were created in the world, the essential nature of the state changed very little, because it had something to do with the way in which the idea of a state and who the normative citizen is, and who's the protector and who's the protected and how does the state work, continues to be the same. And about that exercise of power, which can take colonial, which takes colonial forms too. So that link, and therefore I think it's not coincidental, the statements, the misogynist statements and actions of the ruling party, of RSS members, of the idea that the Prime Minister himself is seen as being worthy because he doesn't have any family, he doesn't have any, he doesn't have a wife, he doesn't have children, so this is not one that he acknowledges anyway, but that he's serving the mother nation, that he's serving, and he has an elderly mother who he's a good son to, in that projection. So this idea of the leader, of the political leader, as this cultic figure who is free from these kinds of problems of domesticity or attachments or any of that, and has a certain kind of ascetic thing in that he serves the mother nation but does not have any, and in line with that, the RSS members and all of these people who see themselves as being these strong, pure warriors of the India that has to come, of the great India that has to come, who will not be detracted from any of this by, by any ordinary domestications of life. So women are part of these organizations, but in an ancillary way, and not in the key way. And their language, their gendered language is significant, their use of that gendered language. I don't know if we are also meant to talk about the forms of resistance right now or later.
Yes, I was going to ask that actually, because none of you gave much hope.
Forms of resistance, I think that, so the very things that are the sources of extremism and violence are also potentially the sites of resistance, and we also see that. So the attacks on universities in India, on free thinking, free speech in universities have been significant, from Hyderabad University to JNU to BHU, a whole range of educational and university institutions, and that is precisely where a new kind of response and resistance is emerging. So students have been, student unions and university campuses have been key to this. Last year in February there was this episode at JNU and then at Hyderabad, but at the JNU one you would have maybe heard of names of people like Kanhaiya Kumar and others who were taken to court, deemed seditious, anti-national. So there's a lot of struggle around the right to resist the regime, and students are on these campuses are doing that. The solidarities and coalitions also extend to farmers who are protesting for, because there's actually no improvement in the conditions in spite of what the government says. Some of the more blatant attacks on journalists and media people have also, it seems, backfired on the government. So recently there was a report in The Wire that the BJP president's son, his business had gone from less than £1,000 to millions of pounds in 1 year, and that was just, so the reporter, what she had done is studied the documents and put this out, And the government immediately reacted in a very high-profile way and said, we're going to sue this, publication and this the journalist for and the editor for 100 crores, a huge, enormously huge amount of money. So the very fact that they are going, the government decided to be so high-profile in trying to suppress this kind of news is leading people also to join forces and build an alternative. So there are still a handful of media that one can see that are holding out in spite of all the pressures. So the struggles of the farmers, workers, students, caste activists, anti-caste activists, all Dalit activists. These are, I guess, the sites of hope, as well as I think to a wider extent, people now in mainstream India being able to see a bit more of what has always been happening, or to an extent in rural areas, to the lower castes, to people in Kashmir, to people in the northeast. So it's driving home. It's driving home that thing, that this kind of violence, because many people in Kashmir and the northeast would say, well, we have been seeing this kind of violence for decades now. It's only that the middle classes in the urban cities are now waking up to it because it's affecting them. Because they cannot see an improvement in their standard of living, because demonetization affected them too, because they read the newspapers and now they can see some of this. So in a sense, it's also, I would say that there's some amount of recognition of the kinds of violence that until now have been happening in parts of the country to people who were never privileged. But now there is an echo of that, since there is an expanding frame of that violence. So it's letting people see things that were not visible to them, even though they were in their sights. I would say that those are the forms of resistance, and that, like anywhere else, these forms of resistance as well as these forms of oppression are transnational. There are numerous similarities with Turkey, with the US, even the numerous similarities in terms of the political leaders, how they function, what kind of message they send out, the way people are pitted against each other, the attacks on symbolic targets and so on. So I think it is part of a global falling apart of the post-Second World War liberal democratic idea that held out certain promises. And what's happening now is that it's all just shattering to bits, and we are seeing that, and one can only hope that this is it's the darkest before dawn, so that this is something that the planet needs to overcome, because the people are being killed. It's all of these leaders, the way in which they act on land, on territory, on violence, on climate change. Significant parallels, and I think that it's in the interests of everyone to know more about how and what forms these processes are taking in different parts of the globe.
Yes, before I am going to, because I'm sure there are lots of questions, and there are things that I would also like to ask our speakers, but before we go on, I think we had 3 excellent interventions on this question of what the roots of extremism are, and I just want to, before we go on further, just summarize them, because I think they were all very distinct and very useful for us to think about. I think Taimur showed us how extremism is located in the making of state power. I mean, that's how I saw it. Especially a form of state power that is apparently democratic, but it maintains the rule of elites as well as the army. So you see sort of extremism being sort of used, religious fundamentalism being used to maintain this version of state power. With Debesh, we got a sense of the making of majoritarian politics and the kinds of multiple levels of exclusions and violences it carries, especially vis-a-vis, this majoritarian politics, and how it stands against a range of minorities, and then in doing that puts, values such as secularism, democracy, even the idea of the post-colonial into question, because you see colonial practices of post-colonial states, as Debesh argues. Finally, Natasha, I think, each point is something to think about. I always find her, very fascinating. But I think mainly you showed the sort of the banal nature of this kind of extremism. It's not just fringe elements out there. It's at every level. I mean, you just need to open Facebook and you can see it. But in that nature, there are certain fundamental underpinning forces that make it sort of an everyday feature and makes that violence in so many forms, symbolic, political, cultural, physical, as you mentioned. But this delinking of economy and culture, I think, is very, very fundamental and something to really question and think about. A couple of days ago, I was in Berlin, taking a workshop for a number of people who work for the civil service across Europe. And I was speaking about populism and obviously Trump and Modi and others. And one student was quite disturbed and she said, why do you say that Trump's populism is racist? A number of my friends actually voted for Trump because he had this anti-globalization message. And obviously I was sort of, okay, I have a long answer to give, but even before I could give my answer, I had a Black American student who took the next half an hour to just explain what it was, and I just could clap at the end of it. But this sort of delinking is so fundamental, and we take it so much for granted in our sort of everyday conversations that it's really worth thinking about it. So thank you very much, and I just wanted to mention this so that we sort of remember what you said. But yes, now Natasha obviously has, despite it is quite dark and to think about these things, but given us some hope. But Taimur, would you do that for us? Give us some hope.
You're the one organized on ground, trying to resist. So.
Well, I think the most important thing to recognize in such a movement is that whether a movement has historical vitality. I mean that in the sense that a movement may be very violent, it may be very strong at any given point in history. And societies, the way they develop unevenly, they can go in various directions. So at any given time, different movements can arise, and some can be very reactionary, others can be very progressive. But the question is whether this form of extremism has any historical vitality in the sense, can it really capture the imagination of, let's say, the brightest people in that society? Can it really solve the problems, the fundamental historical problems that confront that society? In the larger course of history, where will Mr. Modi stand, or where will Mullah Omar stand, or where will Hafiz Saeed stand, etc.? They will be nowhere. They totally belong in the dustbin of history. The essential problem is not a problem of why the right wing is so strong, in my view. The real problem is, why is the left so weak, given how strong the left has been through most of the 20th century. So the solution, psychologists love saying, that the solution to problems doesn't lie in trying to change the world, but it lies in trying to change yourself in such a way so that you achieve what you want to achieve in a given world. So that's what I understand with respect to the left as well, that we have to find modes of resistance that are effective, that channelize and mobilize and energize and inspire and influence people. And the most important thing that I think we've left out, in the last 40 years maybe of the left's own development, we have looked at questions of race, we have looked at questions of gender, we have looked at questions of sexuality, we have looked at questions of physical impairment, we've looked at environment, we've looked at all sorts of questions that relate to our culture, our identity, and so on. But it seems that the terrain that was our home ground, which was that the left, the progressive movement, was going to be a representative of the poor, is a terrain that we abandoned to the right wing. And that, if somebody from a poor background in the United States of America says that Trump stands against globalization and that's why I voted for him, or Modi is with the poor guy, or you know, Jamaat-e-Islami represents us middle class people, that I think represents our failure in not being able to show them, in fact, how these organizations, forces, ideologies do not represent the working people in any shape or form, but represent the interests of property classes and of vested interests and of incredibly rich, powerful people who want to get richer and more powerful. So that's the terrain I think the left needs to reoccupy. That class has to, in my opinion, and of course there's a variety of opinions, but in my opinion, the class struggle, the struggle of the poor against the rich, the struggle of the oppressed against the oppressor, the struggle of working people against, against capitalists and landlords and so on, that's got to be central, because at the end of the day, the millions of people do consider these issues to be very fundamental to their well-being, and so we have to tap back into that, and that's, I think, what Corbyn has successfully done. I mean, he entered into an area which was left completely unoccupied because the Labour Party had moved to the centre had moved to the right, and so on, and there was this huge space of the left. And when he said, what was it, for the many and not the few, that's caught on precisely because he's put, class right back into the center of the political debate. And so I think that's really, and it worked, despite the fact that the entire media of the United Kingdom, including even some of the very most left-wing media houses you have, till the very last, I think that even the Guardian was completely against Corbyn and making fun of him and so on. Till the last 2 weeks, in fact, most of the media was saying, it's such a disaster, the Labour Party is going to get a trouncing and so on. And how wrong they were all proven. I mean, this is the fascinating thing. They were proven they were completely out of touch with what you people were thinking, people in the United Kingdom were thinking. And I think that really is the case. The same can be said for Bernie Sanders. I've met many American political scientists, and they say, oh, Sanders couldn't possibly have won. They would have had him for breakfast. Sanders would not have won that election. Thank God Hillary came out on top, etc., etc. But quite frankly, I think they're just as out of touch with American politics as media houses in the US, in the UK were. In fact, I think that if the Democratic Party had elected Sanders to be its presidential candidate, you would not have had Trump, because Sanders would have managed to occupy that very space that Trump capitalized upon by saying Hillary is a candidate for Wall Street. That's the space that he managed to get. He got a lot of poor people to vote for him, precisely because they thought Hillary was a rich person's candidate. And so that's, I think, one of the key things that we have to look at is we have to reoccupy that space where class, the question of class, along with all the other questions of race, gender, sexuality, etc., become central to our politics.
Thank you.
Yes, I just, there's a quote that I wanted to share with you. It goes thus. We are socialists, we are enemies of the capitalistic economic system for the exploitation of the economically weak, with its unfair salaries, with its unseemly evaluation of a human being according to wealth and property, instead of responsibility and performance, and we are all determined to destroy this system under all conditions. If you know who it is that said that, then hold on for just a second. If you don't know and can guess, could I have 1 or 2 guesses? If you already know, then don't bother. I'll ask you at the end. Anyone?
No idea.
Would you be surprised if I told you that this was Adolf Hitler on the 1st of May 1927? So I think the point I'm trying to make with that is that I'm in terms of like, we are on the same wavelength, Temur, you and I, on the dreams, right? On what should happen, because economic misery is not an abstract fact. I mean, you could say the economy is growing at 5% in India, and you know whether the growth has slowed or increased. Yes, but how does that actually bear up with the fact that yesterday there was the news report that a woman was mourning the death of her 11-year-old daughter who had died asking for rice. They were desperately poor, and the woman's entitlement for food, her ration card, was not linked to the Aadhaar project, which is a biometric project of entitlement and surveillance that this government has put at its center. They want everyone to link into Aadhaar. So the idea is that it will be about ensuring entitlement, but it is also a surveillance project. Now this woman's card, so it was a kind of technocratic rationality, technocratic bureaucratic rationality, this idea, and in fact it meant that an 11-year-old girl died asking for rice out of starvation this week, this year. So it is not simply the fact that those who are poor do not have their entitlements. I'm just trying to say that the process, or that if we were to fight for their rights, it would somehow, the left would be able to succeed by simply making these arguments. Because I think that although Jeremy Corbyn's case is an excellent one in the UK, I don't think that the political spectrum in India, for example, is as narrow as it is here. So here, just a position that is as leftist as Corbyn's is seen as out of left field, as it were. But in India, there have been historically communist parties too. There have been these leftist parties who have been, talking about these things for a long time. But in practice, they have still managed to be okay with corruption, to still be okay with nationalism and with the killing of, for example, people in Kashmir, or with other such projects. So I think that the ideological spectrum, so that language certainly in the Indian case is not something that people have not used or haven't been using, but that language itself has also become one way of continuing with politics as usual. And of course right now it's exceptionally failing, because the right has, I think, the political right wing has, I think nationalism has now become the preferred language of neoliberalism. So when the right wing in India wants to dispossess people, wants to, capitalize certain sectors of the economy, financialize them, etc., they do not say that is what they are doing. They appeal to the people through a language of nationalism and of glory and of greatness, etc. So I'm saying that that kind of economic violence is couched in a language of culture and society. And also, I mean, apart from corruption, the casteism, the masculinism, etc. of the left is also important. So I would rather use the term progressive, but because there are many, there are communists in India who wear the sacred thread. There are communists in India who can be oppressive in other contexts as well. So I don't think the traditional idea of the left is what is going to help us, although the traditional impulse of the left is really important. Not their form of political organization, but the idea that people don't need to, people should not be starving, that there is violence, and I think for that what's a good word for blind spot? For that, the kind of inability of the left to see beyond the nationalism is problematic, because the left says, well, we care about the people who are poor, but they do not move beyond that idea of, well, but of course, Kashmir is an integral part of India, for example, in spite of the fact that they care for poor people. So I don't know how one, the important thing is obviously not to give up dreaming for and acting for a better future, where instances like this are not just buried in the news, but they are. I mean, tomorrow there'll be something else that will happen. So the sheer scale of misery, I think, is something that people are unable to see because of the way in which, I guess, the semantic scale of democracy and development and growth and and the visible city architecture. So people just, the underlying continual misery enforced by a notion and a kind of politics is not being changed, and if anything is getting worse. I'm sorry, this is ending up being really depressive, and I didn't want to do that. I just think that if we just use even Trump wanted to attack the elite, drain the swamp, etc. So they all say, all the political leaders now understand that speaking on behalf of the poor people is good, whatever they actually do once they end up in power. And that I don't know if, and if the left, which has been doing that and still also being nationalist, I just think that
Yeah, I see your point. But with respect to India, I mean, it's a huge country, and so what happens in one part of the country and another part is completely at poles apart. So while there's a left in India, it's largely confined to 3 states: Kerala, Tripura, and West Bengal. If there was a significant left in what's called the Hindi belt, we might have seen a different configuration, in my view, in the sense that certainly the Congress party, I think you'll agree, over time has come to be seen not as a party of the poor. And that's what has led to its decline. And created the space where the BJP right has moved in and occupied. In much the same way, you can see the same process in Pakistan, where the left of center space was always occupied by the Pakistan People's Party. And after the 1990s, the PPP largely accepted the neoliberal paradigm, gravitated economically towards the right, although politically in other ways they were quite liberal. They tried to frame themselves as being liberal. How liberal they were is another debate. And that also cost the People's Party, it went into complete decline. This time round in Lahore, where there was an election, People's Party came 5th. They could only gather, 1,500 votes or so. It was such a massive decline. No political parties probably had such a big decline. So my point is, and of course, to the extent that the left itself, or leftist parties or socialist parties, are seen to have unfairly or opportunistically compromised with the powers that be, there also they will suffer a decline. One can argue the case of the CPM. For example, when the CPM undertook its land reforms, for 36 years it capitalized on essentially having undertaken a very comprehensive, the most comprehensive land reform in India. And because they couldn't move beyond that for various reasons, and because then they were perceived after Nandigram as being not on the side of the poor, but on the side of the investors that were coming in for the land, that cost them the entire election. That cost them their entire base. Conversely, in Kerala, where progressive reforms, and there's been really some fantastic educational programs in education, and in Tripura as well, they've managed to retain their power base. So my point isn't whether communist parties, socialist parties, leftist parties have lived up to the dream. That is open to debate and criticism. My point is that space, people want change from neoliberalism. People want change from this horrible form of capitalism that's under the rhetoric of globalization. And people desperate enough for change will go to whoever they hear, who is making big promises. And of course, Hitler in 1927, Hitler and also Mussolini, the entire fascist movement emerged from the Socialist Party of Italy. Mussolini was a member of the Socialist Party of Italy. And of course, the Nazis were called National Socialists. Why? And in fact, the party that Hitler merged with was called the Workers' Party of Germany, etc. I forget the exact name, the small group with which Hitler merged and then became the Nazi Party. So the role of ideology always is that it has to appeal to the poor and dispossessed in order to build support for those who have money. There is no point in any ideology. An ideology has no social utility if it only says, okay, I'm rich and I'm going to get richer. That's the whole point of Nazism, that's the whole point of Hindutva, that's the whole point of religious extremism. Our role perhaps is, and that's the whole point of social democracy even in my view, and that also has become the point of many parties that claim to be socialist. Syriza is another example. I mean, that's quite fascinating to see. You have a government that came to power on the promises of, rolling back the bankers and the IMF and all of that, and rolling back austerity, and then implemented austerity, and then you see the unique phenomena of the party protesting against its own government. I haven't seen that anywhere else in the world. It's quite unique. So my point is this: of course, you not only have to make the right promises, we have to deliver on those promises. But we seem to have moved into a domain, we seem to have focused to a very large extent on the issue of domain, in the domain of culture. We focused a lot on the domain of ideology and a lot on the domain of culture. And sometimes that's occurred at the expense of the domain of the economic. And we've got to, while our focus on culture is very important, we cannot let that go, because if we do let that go, it falls into the hands of people like Hitler, Trump, Modi, and others, who will then utilize that economic grievance for right-wing purposes. The economic grievance of the German people was not it was genuine, it was real. The Treaty of Versailles and the kind of reparations imposed upon Germany after World War I created a major financial and economic crisis in Germany. And Hitler was smart enough to understand that, and then to utilize that in his favor by making these promises that, of course, he had no intention of keeping. So that's the fact that fascism was in fact a popular movement. It was the most popular movement of Europe. Fascism wasn't some crazy loony idea of some 5 people sitting in some room. It was the trendy, sexy thing to do in the 1930s, was to be a fascist. Why was it so popular? Why was Hitler able to get millions and millions of votes? And in 5 years, he turned his party around. The fundamental thing was that he appealed to the poor. That's the fact. He crushed the left and won over a substantial section of the rural voters in the north of Germany, and utilized that when he had 1/3 of the parliament, and he had the aristocracy with him, then he could get rid of the parliament and institute his dictatorship. So the lesson from that is not that we need to make false promises, but the lesson from that is that the domain of economics is a very important domain. I'm not going to say it's the most important, I'm not saying that, but it is extremely important, and we need to recapture that. That's my opinion.
And I think the disagreement here is...
Sorry, so you can say something and then I'll take some questions.
I think the disagreement is that I would say that economy and culture are not separate domains, and I think that is I guess at the core of it. Because the way in which the economy is projected as something that is abstract, has its own laws, is quantitatively separate, doesn't take into account the way in which the very cultural processes, incentives, behaviors, languages construct a certain idea of the economy. I mean, if you look at, for example, in India, demonetization would be a good case study for this. Like after demonetization, demonetization was something that was clearly, an economic thing. But the way in which it was presented was that it is a purification that people have to undergo, suffering that people have to undertake in order to for the nation's greater good. Now, at the end of that the use of that spiritual language to re-engineer completely and something which is ostensibly purely economic, and at the end of it, people who've suffered from not having money, who died in queues, etc., end up voting the same party back to power, because of the appeal of that spiritual language, which undoes in the understanding the purely economic. And likewise, when they talk about, when, for example, Modi says that, has said on past occasions that people have to, we'll bring development with a soul to the people. And because of that, the villages will be like this and people will be self-reliant, etc. He's encouraging and incentivizing certain kinds of economic behaviors, but using a language of spirituality, soul, suffering, etc. to make that happen. So I guess my point is that they, and my worry is that whether the institutions can withstand what is happening right now. I mean, we know the whole thing about the electronic EVMs in India, because I think that this kind of authoritarianism, this politics of authoritarianism, that where the left and the right both claim to be speaking on the part of on the behalf of the poor, and the left does not, provide any alternative to a nationalist language of the right. So nationalism is something they both share. Neoliberalism is something that both of them claim to be opposing, but the right then ends up being more successful because they can find a language of spirituality, nationalism, etc. to push through those policies which otherwise people would not want to have happen because it would challenge vested interests. So I think that it's a kind of political communication, technology of political communication that's enabling this kind of authoritarianism. And I think the role of technology here is quite crucial, because many of the people we would look to for, or many of these sites that we would look to for challenges end up being overwhelmed by this, the viral nature of these political messages. So, anyway, sorry.
Right. Because we have time, we have only less than half an hour for question. Yeah. Only one. I've kept quiet in general. I think there are more similarities than differences. And one of the problems on the part of the left has always been that we end up arguing so much over tiny differences, then we lose the battle. Right? And it has happened. So for instance, when I, let's say, invite Taimur, oh, why Taimur, and then why Natasha, why Divyesh? I'm sure on the left there's a particular thing about one is, there's also competition of purity kind of thing. Anyway, now going to culture and economy kind of, I was just wondering, so for instance, and you shouldn't answer it because we need time for question answers. For instance, there's always this debate within the left of the identity politics, culture, how much focus should be on that, and we need to go back to the basics kind of things, and we have that within the department also, these discussions. I was thinking, for instance, let's take example of sexuality. Most queer people would be working class. Most women would be working class. So most people who would be religious, cultural minority would also be working class. Therefore, we have to be careful about distinguishing, or rather rescuing class politics from other kinds of identity politics, given that all other kinds of identity politics are also connected to class politics. So somehow we have to come up with a more intersectional politics which takes into account class, caste, culture, gender, sexuality, and various other things. On that one, let's shift to
Definitely, it's time to ask a few questions. So
take 3 or 4 together.
Yeah, let's take about 3 or 4 together. So yes.
I just have one question regarding your comment at the beginning and also with the end with Natasha would be that you imply, I don't know, I understand from your talk that somehow Islamization, even the very language of Islamization is something from the right, actually from the Western in Europe. You use the somehow Islamization of Pakistan as something of a big problem. Yeah. So it is enlightening. However, if you're looking at a survey was done in 2013 by Freedom Pakistan, 84% of the people actually supported the idea of Islam having as their religion. And now, as we talk about, when you're not listening to the grievances, actual grievances of the people on the ground, and then we're ignoring and putting our own ideological views on them, then there is a backlash. As you can see in the war on terror that happened. War on terror is not just the extremism, the so-called religious extremism, was not from a vacuum, but rather from a aggressive, secular state suppressing of the people on the ground. And they reacted, as we see in Pakistan, particularly in the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, because you saw the question, for example, the tribal area, the mass kind of attacking them. And so I don't know, how would you reconcile that?
We'll take a few questions.
And another question for Natasha was, we're talking about progression, right? Should I start?
Yeah, can you keep it at one question for now? Yeah, and then we'll take another one later.
As a South Asian, in my opinion, nationalism is, in regarding to South Asian politics, is the biggest concern, obviously. And some ethnic individuals and groups, they use this sense of nationalism to achieve their political intentions, and as well as overcome to their ethnic rebels. But specifically, my question is from Divish, that how do you see the where do you see nationalism between the people? How do people react in regarding to the nationalism? And where do you see the future of the Indian politics after Modi? And I've got another question regarding the religious radicalism as well from you. You mentioned about the religious radicalism in Pakistan, and you clearly say that this idea of religious radicalism emerged after Pakistan got allied with the United States of America. But then why would you call it a religious radicalism? What is the religion to do with the radicalism? And yeah.
Okay. Are there any questions from this side of the room? Yes.
Clarity of the activists, because I want to say something about all the left in Pakistan, the representative left of the Pakistan People's Party, all they have contributed for the creation of extremism, of the religious extremism in Pakistan.
Relation between left and religious extremism. So how has PPP led to religious extremism?
So, Khalid, do you want to ask your question? Khalid, do you want to ask your
Should I give the other question as well?
yeah, but keep it short because I've just noticed another hand on my very short.
Very short, probably about 150 words.
No, more like 20.
You both speak about progress, though we don't know what progress is, but still giving the mind of economic progress. Then how would you define the cultural progress in terms of if we're moving from A to B, so what would be that B then?
Okay, and there's one question back.
This is for Dr. Rahman. You talked about the economic and political side. On the economic side, why did the left in Pakistan fully embrace neoliberal nationalism rather than move towards, for example, a localized form of state capitalism like South America did, or Central Asia did, or China and Russia did? And on the political side, Pakistan in the last 4 to 5 years has witnessed an upsurge of a largely urban youth center-rightist movement that is almost only non-violent. Why hasn't Pakistan witnessed a similar movement or momentum on its left? Why is the left completely absent from this new challenge to the post-colonial structure?
Yes, Taimur, you can start with a few questions.
So, to answer, I'll begin with your question. Why am I characterizing religious extremism in the way that I am? You have to look at the political content of the movement as well as its economic and cultural content. It has, in the context of Pakistan, religious extremism or Islamic fundamentalism has always stood solidly against all working class movements. So, for example, when there was a big movement in the 1970s, there was a huge conference in Toba Tek Singh called, it was the Great Peasant Conference held in Pakistan's history, where up to 100,000 peasants gathered and demanded land reform. And the religious right-wing parties, which I mentioned, that doesn't mean all religious parties or all religious people. I'm talking about religious right-wing parties, because that itself was led by a Maulana Bhashani led that movement. But the religious right-wing parties opposed land reforms in Pakistan. And they argued that under Sharia, land reforms is not possible. So in fact, they defended what we call Jagirdari, what we call feudalism. Similarly, on the question of the nationalization of big industry in the 1970s, they favored the privatization and the denationalization of all of that industry. And with respect to women's rights, I mean, there is really little debate at all that they stand on an extreme pole. If I were to read out to you the decisions taken by the Taliban government in Afghanistan about what the laws would be for women, even you would be appalled. Even those people who are religious are completely appalled by what their conditionalities are. They're ridiculous in the extreme. And many people would argue that even Islam does not say the things that they have instituted. With respect to your question, why do I call it religious extremism? Because it is. That's the basis, that is the ideological terrain on which they justify their actions. And for them it's not it's not cynical for them. A man who is ready to give up his life because he believes that he is defending his religion is not being cynical about it. He really means it, or she really means it. She really believes that that is what their religion demands. So the reason why we call it religious extremism is because it is a form of extremism which uses the ideological terrain of religion or Islam to justify its actions. That cannot be separated. Now you may think that that is not what Islam is historically. I may think that is not what Islam is historically. But that's irrelevant, because it's irrelevant because the people who do follow that do it because they are religious and because they believe that that is what their religion asks.
Are you not exploiting religion?
Sorry?
Are they not exploiting religion?
That is your view, my friend. But just because that is your view doesn't mean that you can say to them that they are not religious. That would be an absurd statement. They are religious. They are much more religious than you and I are, for example. On the question of you saying that 84% of Pakistani people supported XYZ opinion, these public opinion polls do not adequately or clearly represent what's going on in Pakistan. You're talking about a society that is partially in civil war. You know that 50,000-60,000 people have died in this conflict with religious extremism in Pakistan. From all sides included.
No, secular extremism.
Sorry?
Secular extremism. That's secular extremism.
Secular extremists?
The same way use the same language as using opposing the religion.
Okay, I am completely a secular extremist. Thank you for bringing that up. There's nothing wrong with being a secular extremist as long as I'm not using violence.
Well, you're using them in that sense because.
No, I'm not using violence. I use a guitar. I sing. But in my, can I finish what I'm saying? 84% people. I am not opposed to. I am not interested in wordplay here. You can attach the word extremism to this or that. What I'm interested in is what do those people represent in the context of that society. I tried to show you that they have defended the most reactionary sections of that society. And the statistics that you point out are not accurate, because if you come to me in Pakistan on the street and you say, Taimur, do you support Islamization? If a government official or somebody comes to me and says, Taimur, do you support Islamization of Pakistan? I'll probably say, yeah, sure. In fact, I do not. And the reason is that you are not dealing with a society where people are free to express their opinion on religion. You have instances where a student who expressed his opinion on religion, although it was a pretty moderate opinion, got lynched to death by his fellow students, Mashal Khan. You have a situation where a person who criticized a law, Article 295C, was killed by his own bodyguard, and there are hundreds of thousands of supporters of the bodyguard and almost very few supporters of the governor, because people believe he committed blasphemy, whereas in fact he did not. That's the context in which we are that we're talking about. So you're not going to get a fair and you're not going to get a public opinion poll that accurately represents opinion. But however, when people do go into a ballot where they actually go and cast a vote, where their vote is, an opinion is relatively speaking more anonymous, there you do get a slightly more accurate representation of their opinion, and there you see that the religious parties that call for Islamization have been trounced again and again and again in all elections.
Let's stop there
go
because,
to the next?
Yes, let's go to the...
So, on the question of the Pakistan People's Party, the Pakistan People's Party was a very big party. So it had many different factions. At one time, it took very opportunistic decisions with respect to the role of religion in the public sphere. So they were the party that in fact argued that Ahmadis should not be considered Muslims. And they also had some moderate Islamic reforms, etc. But to their credit also, they were the main party that led the resistance to Islamization throughout the 1980s, which was under General Zia. When Benazir came to power though, she came to power after an agreement was reached with the armed forces of Pakistan. And to her credit or discredit, she stuck to that agreement. And it cost her not only her government many times, but it cost her her popular support and base as well. So in my opinion, the strategy that the PPP has followed has been, how do we get into power and how do we stay in power? Because if we get into and stay in power, we can moderate the impact of what's going on around us. We can manage the impact of what's going on around us, whether that's neoliberalism or whether that's extremism. So for example, when the Taliban took power in Afghanistan, instead of criticizing it, Benazir was very supportive. So that was, in my view, an opportunistic stance. So it cost, and so the irony is they've also been the victim of religious extremism, but they've also not been managed to create the kind of momentum needed to counter religious extremism. On the last question, could you just refresh my memory about your question?
On the political side,
yes,
there's an upsurge in sort of...
Oh, why the left hasn't yes, I remember now, thank you. Yes, yes. Very good question. So, within the left in Pakistan, there are several formations. As I said, the PPP gravitated towards the center. And so the PPP pretty much got decimated, except for Sindh, interior Sindh. What exists on the left of the PPP, the whole spectrum of Pakistan has been moving on towards the right. But what exists on the left of the PPP is very interesting. The various splits of the Pakistan People's Party after the 1990s have all been towards the right. There's not been a single split of the PPP that gravitated towards the left. That's one very interesting factor. So what exists beyond that is the Awami Workers' Party, my party, which is called the Workers and Peasants Party, a very small communist party, and a group and a bunch of other left-wing groups who do not have the kind of resources needed to even reach the 200 million people you would need to reach in order to be an effective force. So we've been working on various ways in which the left can get together. But big spontaneous upsurges of working class power do take place in Pakistan. So for example, one example is, since 2000, the upsurge of the Anjuman-e-Muzari in Punjab, which was a movement of about 900,000 people, affected 900,000 people, although not all 900,000 were involved in the movement, for land rights. There was the Fisher Folk movement, which was a very big movement of people who do fishing, etc. There is a very big movement in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa of the Hashnagar peasants. So there have been many pockets of resistance that mushroom spontaneously. The left gravitates and helps them. But so far the Pakistani left has not managed to get itself organized enough to be effective on the national level, mainly because the obstacles placed, the institutional obstacles placed in their path after 2 decades of Islamization are quite significant. So if you want to organize a meeting, you want to organize a demonstration, you want to do a press release, you want to do a press conference, the number of hoops that you have to jump through in order to do the simplest thing is so incredibly high that it drains nearly all our energy to do those things. Now my view is that social media has provided us an enormous new gateway which allows us to bypass many of those hoops. And I'm hoping that the Pakistani left can be encouraged to use this platform to organize more effectively all over Pakistan. We're working on that.
Okay, I'm just going to give a minute each to Devesh and Natasha before we end, if that's okay. That's all right.
In fact, in terms of nationalism, and the question is, what after Modi? I mean, let's say if Modi is over, that would be good news. The problem is that by the time he leaves, maybe the common sense of, or let's say broadly Indian body politics may have shifted further to the right, where Modi gets seen as moderate and, as Natasha was pointing out, Adityanath gets seen as the more stronger nationalist leader. Or for that matter, even if BJP somehow loses the elections, right? And yet you may have Congress and other parties who start speaking the language of the BJP. That's a real risk in India, where forever, in a sense, this particular regime has changed the political culture in India. That's a real risk. In terms of nationalism in the region, nationalism can be forced for good, right? When it is anti-colonial, the problem is whenever it occupies the state and controls the state, then it becomes colonial, right? And final one point I'll relate it to is the terminologies and religious extremism and are they exploiting or not. Now, one fundamental hypocrisy that people who use religion have is, if everything is religion, fine, it's religious, we love Hinduism or Islam or whatever, and anything wrong they say, but that's not religious, right? Now, let's say if is ISIS representative of Islam or not? Go and ask Yazidi people who have had genocide committed to them. Is Buddhism genocidal or not? Maybe go and speak to Rohingyas and tell Rohingyas that, oh no, it's not real Buddhism. Now we can say it's not real Buddhism, but if Buddhist monks are leading the movement and saying that in the name of Buddhism we are doing it, or if ISIS is doing it and they're using Islam to do it, then who are you or I to tell them that that's not real Islam or not real Buddhism? So the point of the matter is, if we critique US and say, oh, democracy, a secular democracy is wrong, look at what US has done. But then we have to look at what Iran and Saudi Arabia have done in the name of Islam, or what India is doing in the name of Hinduism, what I said Burma is doing in the name of Buddhism, and then we have to have equal kind of non-hypocrisy to then say that then they represent Islam. We can't reject idea of secular, what do you call it, secular left or left, based on the performance of left, until unless we are also agreeing to reject religion on the basis of performance of those who are religious.
Good point.
How do you avoid national...
Can we take this outside?
We'll take it later. I'll explain later. We don't have
But some of us are people, so that's what you want to say.
I think the question for me was deceptively simple. It was, what would the dream be for the dream in the domain of culture be for progressives? Well, it is what it should not be is what it in fact often is, which is that of a monocultural purity of a nation, from which all kinds of differences are sought to be expelled or uniformized, made more uniform and taken in as not being different at all. So I think that the real but on a more general question, what are the economic and social dreams or cultural dreams? Bread and roses. I mean, as we go back, it's people need bread to eat and they need to have dignity to live as people. So the trouble seems to be though that in order to deliver the bread, things would need to be changed, which would anywhere, which would affect vested interests. So what we need is a kind of politics, a kind of political leadership, and a conception of power that makes it possible for the challenging of those vested interests in order to deliver the bread to everyone and for everyone to have the roses, which is to say dignity and food, to be seen as something that is a viable project. And we have so few of, we have a notion of politics that is anything but like that. We have a validation and worshipping of a kind of leadership which does the exact opposite of that. We need to have a kind of politics, a notion of power as positive, a notion of leadership as something that makes it possible for people to see that the having of bread for all and for everyone to have the roses, and I'm using bread and roses as in the old metaphor of food and dignity, is something that is overall in everyone's interests. So we need to have an idea of self-interest that is conveyed in such a way that people understand why it makes sense, because otherwise the kinds of violence just perpetuate, and we can try to sort of say it's happening in another neighborhood, it's happening in another part of the world, but as Martin Luther King would have said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. These things are linked in very in sometimes very simple ways, but that are made to seem like complicated because we have, because it's happening in India, because this is happening in the US, or because this is happening to a person who looks like this. Actually, all of these things feed off each other. And it is important to really ask what that dream is and why it is important. Because we can all recognize our own nightmares, but we cannot, the social nightmare that is all around us in large parts of the world, we somehow cannot see, including in our, in here. Going back to Corbyn, the homelessness, the deprivation, the kinds of things that are not inevitable. That's the tragedy of it all. That it's not inevitable that it has to be like that. You don't need to have a totalitarian, Stalinist to leftist society in order for people to see the horrors of totalitarianism of any kind. That people deserve their freedom, and that they do not want to, should not be made to compromise on their dignities. But unfortunately, this trade-off that you can either have your freedoms or you can have development, is just so problematic, but also so present everywhere.
Okay. I've taken over as chair. We have a couple of more questions. We have got apart from him, anyone else who has questions or comments? Okay.
Another question regarding the relation between neoliberalism and nationalism. So my question is, if neoliberalism is one of the main causes, arguably, of nationalism, especially on people who are most affected by its policies, and if neoliberalism is an ideology because it impacts people's experiences, so consequently being part of the structure of society from the very beginning of our lives. So how would you change the common sense that keeps neoliberalism in a dominant position, also with the attempt to stop nationalist reactions to it?
Okay, thanks. There's a question there.
My question is, who should be blamed for the mass killing of people in Pakistan and in Afghanistan from the last 16 years? You can see that loss of society into the civilians and lots of people have been killed. I'll give another example. It was 2 days ago in one part of Afghanistan that about 40 or 50 people have been killed as a society of that. And these extremism was supported mostly by the Pakistani government, by the Pakistani ISI. So do you believe that that's to blame ISI or to blame, who do you think we should blame?
Okay. Any other question? This final round? No? You want to start the question? First question was the both of you. You can start. Okay.
So on neoliberalism and nationalism, and Natasha was also talking about nationalism. I mean, honestly, I find nationalism to be problematic, completely problematic. I find no solidarity between people who, just because I speak the same language or I come from the same part of the world, means next to nothing to me. What I find more important is whether or not I agree with the values that that person has, the actions that that person, with their actions. I think you will continue, as long as neoliberalism, and not just neoliberalism, but perhaps even capitalism remain, I think you will continuously see the political spectrum seesaw between, on the one hand, cosmopolitan neoliberalism combined with liberal culturalism, and on the other hand, nationalism combined with the message for protectionism and control over capital. I think we've seen that throughout the 20th century. I mean, I see the fascist reaction, as also being part of the reaction to a form of neoliberalism. So every system, movies sometimes also reflect philosophy. In The Matrix, which is one of my favorite movies, the game maker says that, you always have to present people with a false choice, because that's what keeps the system going. In this instance, the false choice is, this sort of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. That's the choice you have, and there's no third choice. You can opt for this sort of neoliberal cosmopolitanism, whatever you want to call it, and you can opt for this sort of economic nationalism or whatnot. That's exactly the framework that you guys have to break. So I don't see that cycle breaking without breaking neoliberalism itself. On the question of Afghanistan, in my view, it's not just the recent bombings in Afghanistan for which the state of Pakistan bears responsibility. But in my honest assessment, the last 2 decades, 3 decades now, there has been no state that has done more damage to Afghanistan than the state to which I belong. I've been to Afghanistan, I've been to Kabul, spoken to people. I know the sentiment there, I know the history, and my view is that Afghanistan, if it were not for Pakistan, Afghanistan would have been a prosperous and even a progressive nation, and never have experienced this kind of mass slaughter, civil war, and destruction. We did that. The Pakistani state did that not only with Afghanistan, we did that with East Pakistan. Fortunately for them, they were a bit far away, so the repression against them was not so sustained. But in the case of Afghanistan, where there is really no effective border, this has been continuous. So my submission when I went to Afghanistan, I met with progressives there, and my submission to all Afghan people is that we have to work together, Afghan progressives and Pakistani progressives, to eliminate religious extremism, which is the outgrowth of state policy in Pakistan, and to create a progressive region.
Thank you. No, we don't. No, later you can do it in one-to-one. That's fine.
Okay, Lorenzo. So I think that I've been trying to think through this. The preservation of power, entrenched as it is, and hegemony in our times, I think, consists of people in democracies, living in democracies, which means at least the formal aspects of democracy, but to an extent sometimes substantive ones as well. The hegemony consists in making people who live in democracies be immune to understanding the paradox between nationalism and neoliberalism at its very base in a capitalist democracy, by which I mean that neoliberalism as, capitalism as this structure, that kind of, neoliberalism as its ideology, capitalism as this structure requires free movement of labor and capital, the free markets, the markets that decide, less regulation, etc., because capital and labor both move. Nationalism at its very base is about imposing what I call global labor sanctions. People cannot move across boundaries. So even the theoretical idea that there is going to be equilibria that result in different places because of a matching of demand and supply, of shortages and excesses, cannot happen, because it is not even possible through the basic idea of the way in which these two things run up against each other. Now the question is, how do you make people not see that this is the case, that somehow you can be you can be living in a capitalist democracy and you can think that the system will work and it will match these things, but that in effect will not happen for a whole lot of reasons, nationalism being one key one there. So in order to do that, I think that this common sense, changing that common sense is hard. Part of that is when he said value, part of that is, the way I think of it is drawing attention again and again to the link between what I call link between value and values. That economic value is not some kind of an abstract thing that we get out of thin air. It is something that at its base is linked to a subjective process of valuation, which we decide what we decide to value and what we decide not to value, and how. So the idea of value does not come to us like, does not drop to us from the skies. We as societies define it and decide it. But the thing with scientific split up disciplinary discourses like economics, sociology, psychology, etc. and so on, and which is again very, very modernist way of looking at knowledge, very 19th century, very tied to colonialism and imperialism, is that it makes these questions hard to ask. It makes these questions hard to see across these boundaries. Because the idea is that you're looking at, this is about the economy and the economy will work, blah, blah, blah. This is about society. In this domain, we have to think like this. So I think it creates these separate domains, and then there is a whole kind of infrastructure around keeping scholars within the bounds of methodological nationalism, so that there is a way in which you are not, when you talk about questions, you are only you stop at the boundaries of that particular nation state. Even when you are looking at that as a problem of knowledge or a question of research. So I think that there isn't an answer, but I think these things are the very fact that I think that we meet, we talk about them, consciousness grows, social movements grow, succeed sometimes and don't, but it's the absurd rationale that Beckett would say, can't go on, must go on. It is horribly difficult to imagine that there will be a better world, and yet that is the most important thing that we cannot let go of, that a better world is possible, will always be possible. That's sort of thing. Unless one subscribes to some kind of a teleology that comes from religion, or some kind of teleology of kind of things getting better, or apocalyptic teleology of things always getting worse, the only way in which we can live as human beings who are also being human is to keep trying.
So on that note, where we end with the hope that she's talking about, that we have to keep trying, right? And then also the fact that, for instance, what Taimur was pointing out in terms of the struggles must go on. There would be uphill battles, but the fact that we can keep talking and we must keep talking, that reminds us, look, and especially, and I'll conclude the whole idea of university. So what's the point of having these discussions within the university? It's partly it's not that we are experts and we know everything. A lot of time you'll find differences, we 100% don't know that it will work. It's partly saying this, that look, let's have hope. We also giving ourselves hope. In that context, in terms of the reason we chose politics, extremism and violence in Pakistan, India, and so Pakistan first, India later, the rationale behind that was because whenever we talk of India and Pakistan, or Pakistan, India, it's usually India first, right? India and Pakistan. We thought let's have both Pakistan and India, but we need to carry on these conversations, and next time, and Taimur is those of you know, anyway know, but those of you don't, you have missed out on something. He's a great singer, a very passionate one, you have missed that out. So next time, and both time I've spoken with him, I've shared platform, he had bad throat, right? That's part of the problem. But partly we also didn't organize. So let's carry on this conversation, and you too, if you have any more ideas in terms of what kind of things we should do, what kind of topics to have conversation on, please approach us, because we want to carry on speaking around issues that are difficult. We could talk of, oh great India, great Pakistan, their market for our students kind of thing, but not market for us, their market for potential students. Yes, there are markets for potential students, but we don't do these things because of that. We do it because we believe that we should bring about change in those countries, but also in the wider world. So on that note, let me thank you for coming here, and happy Diwali to you all.